Fuck marble columns. Fuck everything they taught you about Rome. The aqueducts, the philosophy, the noble senate debating laws in clean white togas. None of that matters. What matters is a room, a specific room, underground, beneath the Palatine Hill, where the emperors lived and ate and fucked and killed. The floor was stone. You need to understand about the floor. Stone is porous. It absorbs things. By the end of the second year, the floor of that room had absorbed so much blood, so much sweat, so many other fluids I'm not going to name yet, that it had changed color permanently, dark brown in the center, almost black where the drain was supposed to be but wasn't, and the smell, copper, salt, old urine, something sweet underneath that you didn't want to identify. The torches made it worse, heat pushing the stench down onto your skin until you wore it home, until your husband smelled it on you days later, and didn't ask questions because asking questions meant acknowledging what everyone knew. This room belonged to Julia Soaemius Bassiana, mother of the emperor, the teenage freak Elagabalus, who dressed like a whore and married a Vestal virgin just to see what would happen. But Julia was worse than her son. Julia was organized, and the worst thing she ever did wasn't the violence. It was the paperwork. Imagine you're 18. No, don't imagine. Feel it. Your name is Livia Drusilla Secunda. Your father has 6 names because that's how Roman aristocracy works. Your husband commands the 9th Legion in Britannia. You've never seen a naked man who wasn't a slave or your husband, and you've barely seen your husband. You married at 14. You're still technically a virgin according to Roman law, because you haven't had 3 children yet. That's the rule they used. A messenger arrives. Imperial seal, purple wax that costs more than the messenger's life. The Empress Julia Soaemias requests your presence at a cultural symposium on feminine virtue and devotion to the imperial family. Request. They always said, request. You put on your finest stola, the white one with purple trim at the hem that cost 800 denarii. You have your slaves arrange your hair with ivory pins. You dab perfume behind your ears. Rose oil from Egypt. Your husband sent it before he left for the frontier. You walk into the palace thinking you've been chosen for something special. Something important. The Empress herself wants to meet you. Your father will be so proud. Your husband's career will advance. The guards don't smile. The guards never smile. They look at your body the way butchers look at an animal they haven't decided to kill yet. They escort you down, not up. Down. Stairs you didn't know existed. Corridors that get narrower and darker until the torches are the only light, and the air tastes like something died here recently. Here's the room. Other noblewomen are already there. You recognize some of them. Your cousin's wife, the daughter of your father's political ally, a woman whose husband dined at your table 3 weeks ago. None of them will meet your eyes. The room is a miniature amphitheatre. Stone benches arranged in a semicircle. On those benches sit men you know. Senators, magistrates, military commanders. Your father's closest friends. They're holding wine cups. They're laughing. They're watching the door as more women are escorted in, and in the centre, on a raised chair draped in purple fabric, sits Julia. She's fat in the way powerful women get fat when they've stopped caring. Rings on every finger. Some of them are sharp on purpose. Her stola is Tyrian purple, the colour that's literally illegal for anyone but the imperial family to wear under penalty of death. Her hair is piled up with gold pins shaped like serpents. She smiles when she sees you. "Welcome, child," she says. "Today we honour the empire. Today you demonstrate your devotion." Devotion. You don't understand yet. You think this is some strange religious ceremony, some fertility ritual from the Eastern cults that Elagabalus brought to Rome. You don't understand that there are scribes in the corner with wax tablets and styluses. You don't understand that this has happened before. Dozens of times. Hundreds of times. You don't understand that your name is about to go into a permanent record. This was not an orgy. Orgies are chaos. Orgies are drunk and disorganized, and everyone pretends it didn't happen the next morning. This was a bureaucracy of rape, scribes. Little weasel men with ink-stained fingers and dead eyes sat in the corner of that room every session and wrote everything down. Names of participants, duration of performance, willingness assessed on a scale of 1 to 10, physical responsiveness, creativity, obedience to instructions, improvement since last session, Because once your name went into the records, you belonged to the system. You would be summoned again, and again, and again, until you were too old or too broken to be useful, at which point your daughter would receive her first invitation. The competitions were scored. I need you to sit with that for a moment. Scored, like fucking gladiatorial games, like chariot races, like the lowest form of entertainment Rome produced. Winners received imperial favor, tax exemptions for their husbands, preferential grain contracts for their families. Public honors that everyone understood were payment for things done in darkness. Losers received something the imperial records call social reduction. Pretty phrase. Let me tell you what it meant. Social reduction meant your family stopped receiving invitations to imperial functions. Your husband's military postings dried up. Your father's political appointments were suddenly under review. Creditors who had been patient for a generation demanded immediate payment. Your daughter's marriage prospects evaporated because no one wanted to be associated with a family that had fallen from imperial favor. And if you tried to refuse entirely, then Julia's messengers visited your father, or your husband, or your brother. They didn't threaten. They didn't need to threaten. They simply explained that refusal to participate in imperial cultural events could be interpreted as a lack of devotion to the imperial family. Lack of devotion. That was treason. Treason meant your family's assets were seized, your male relatives exiled or executed, your children made wards of the state. The state meant Julia. Every single woman in that room understood the math, their bodies or their families, their dignity or their daughters' futures. A few hours of nightmare or a lifetime of watching everyone they loved destroyed. It wasn't a choice. It was a trap that wore a choice's face. I need to tell you about Claudius Severa now. Herodian recorded her name. Cassius Dio recorded her name. She was the wife of a prominent senator. She had a 12-year-old daughter named Marcella. When the first summons came, Claudia refused. Flat. She had influence. She had connections. Her husband sat in the Senate. Her brother commanded troops in Asia Minor. Surely the Empress couldn't. The second summons came 3 days later. It didn't threaten Claudia. It discussed Marcella. What a lovely age. What a perfect age to begin participating in court cultural events. The Empress was so looking forward to meeting the next generation of Roman noblewomen. So eager to see mother and daughter demonstrate their devotion together. Claudia participated for 17 straight months. The imperial records describe her as initially hesitant but demonstrating consistent improvement under corrective guidance. Corrective guidance, those words. Later medical texts from the same period. Texts written by physicians who treated noblewomen in private and never published their findings anywhere official. Describe women seeking treatment for vaginal tearing, for internal injuries, for infections that should not exist in married women of good family, for scar tissue, for psychological symptoms that the physicians didn't have names for but recorded anyway. Inability to speak in the presence of men, uncontrollable, shaking when entering certain rooms, a terror of purple fabric. Claudia Severa's daughter, Marcella, received her first summons at 13. We don't know what happened to her after that. The records stop. The historical sources lose interest. Some nameless scribe in some burned archive might have known. Might have recorded whether Marcella survived, whether she married, whether she had daughters of her own, whether she ever spoke of what happened in that room beneath the hill. But we don't know. History eats women like Marcella and shits out the names of empresses. By the second year, Julia had monetized the symposium. Wealthy merchants could purchase admission, not to participate, to watch. Foreign dignitaries were invited as guests of honor. Rival court officials came to see their enemies' wives humiliated, never realizing their own wives' summons was already being drafted. The price of admission varied. High enough to exclude the mob. Low enough that any wealthy freedman who wanted to see a senator's wife brought low could afford it. Julia charged extra for premium seating, for wine service during the competitions, for commemorative tokens, little bronze coins stamped with symbols I can't describe without violating every obscenity law on this platform. She exported the system. Alexandria had its own cultural symposium by 220 CE. So did Antioch, so did Carthage. Local imperial representatives managed the satellite locations while Julia's scribes traveled between them, standardizing the record-keeping, ensuring every woman's score was recorded in the Central Imperial Archives in Rome, an empire of rape, administered with the same efficiency as grain distribution or tax collection. And the women who survived it? The ones who didn't kill themselves. Some of them became Julia's most loyal servants. You need to understand this part, or nothing else makes sense. The victims became enforcers, because becoming an enforcer was the only way to survive what had been done to them. Some of these women had been ranked, scored, evaluated on their devotion, and found adequate or excellent or insufficient. Some of them had competed against each other in that room, while men they knew watched and drank wine and laughed. And when it was over, when they went home to their husbands and their children and their dinner parties, they had two choices: acknowledge what happened, admit they were degraded in ways that made them unmarriageable by their own cultural standards, face the possibility that their husbands would divorce them, their fathers would disown them, their children would be taken away, or pretend it was normal, pretend it was prestigious, pretend that participating in the Empress's symposium was an honor, a mark of imperial favor, something to be proud of. Most of them chose the second option. Most people would. And some of them went further. Some of them became Julia's lieutenants. They recruited new participants. They trained younger women on what to expect. They shared techniques for surviving the competitions. They learned to read the rankings and maneuver for position and curry favor with the Empress by identifying reluctant participants who needed encouragement. You become the monster, or you admit the monster touched you. Most people choose the first thing. Cassius Dio records suicides among the noble families during this period, but he doesn't moralize about them. He just lists them. Senator's wife cut her wrists in the bath. General's daughter threw herself from the roof. Magistrate's sister stopped eating until she died. Merchant's wife hanged herself with her own stola. He doesn't speculate about why. He doesn't need to. Everyone in Rome knew. Here's what ended it: not a hero, not a senator growing a spine and denouncing the Empress in the forum, foreign policy. Rome's borders were held by alliances, buffer states, client kingdoms whose rulers married their daughters to Roman officials and sent their sons to fight in Roman auxiliary units because they believed Rome was a reliable partner. Then Julia started summoning foreign princesses. The daughter of King Artabanus of Parthia was betrothed to a Roman senator. She received a summons. Her father withdrew her from the marriage alliance and cancelled Parthian military cooperation with Roman forces on the eastern frontier. The daughter of a Cherusci chieftain in Germania, summoned. Her father pulled his warriors out of 3 auxiliary cohorts. Rome desperately needed to hold the Rhine border. Armenian princesses, Thracian noblewomen, daughters of allied kings who commanded armies Rome could not afford to fight. One by one, Rome's alliances started cracking. Not because the kings were morally outraged, they were kings. They had their own systems of exploitation. But because their daughters were not supposed to be degraded by foreigners. Their daughters were political currency, and Julia was debasing the currency. The military noticed first. Generals on the frontiers started reporting that allied units were unreliable, that buffer states were making overtures to Parthia, that the barbarian tribes Rome's allies were supposed to be keeping quiet were suddenly testing the borders. The Senate noticed second. Senators whose provinces bordered hostile territory started realizing that their military protection was dissolving because some Parthian king was offended about his daughter's treatment. Even Elagabalus noticed, the teenage emperor, who spent most of his time painting his face and marrying priests of Eastern cults and generally being too degenerate to govern. Even he realized his mother's system was going to get everyone killed. On March 11th, 222 CE, Elagabalus tried to have his cousin Severus Alexander assassinated. It was desperation. Alexander was popular with the Praetorian Guard. Alexander represented the possibility of a regime change. If Alexander lived, Julia's system would be dismantled, and everyone who had participated, everyone who had watched, recorded, profited, would face consequences. The assassination attempt failed. Alexander was protected by his own guards, and the Praetorians, who had spent 3 years turning from soldiers into pimps, who had been forced to stand outside that underground room, listening to what happened inside, who had been made complicit in the degradation of Rome's aristocracy. The praetorians turned, palace corridor, dawn light through high windows, blood already on the marble. They found Elagabalus hiding in a latrine. They stabbed him to death right there. Dragged his body through the streets of Rome by hooks through the ankles. Tried to stuff the corpse into a sewer, but it wouldn't fit. The emperor was too fat with 3 years of imperial luxury, so they threw him in the Tiber River. Then they went looking for Julia. She ran. Through the same palace corridors where she had walked in her purple stola, past the same rooms where she had planned her symposium expansions, past the same scribes' offices where the wax tablets with hundreds of women's names were still stored. She found a hiding place somewhere in the imperial apartments. She gathered her records, the blackmail material, the proof of what senators' wives had done, the names of everyone who had watched and laughed and paid admission. She thought information would save her. Her face. Not afraid, confused. After everything, after 3 years of absolute power, she genuinely couldn't understand how this was happening. The praetorians found her. She started offering names, details, proof. Senator X's wife did this. Magistrate Y's daughter did that. Commander Z watched the symposium 3 times and requested premium seating. She kept talking until one of the soldiers slit her throat. Then they cut her open from ribs to pelvis, the way you gut an animal for sacrifice. And they dragged her body through the same streets, behind her son's corpse, and threw her into the same river. The records were burned that afternoon. All the wax tablets, all the rankings, all the scores, all the names. Someone, probably Severus Alexander's people, collected every piece of evidence that the symposium had ever existed and reduced it to ash. The underground room beneath the Palatine Hill was sealed, filled with rubble, plastered over. Within a generation, no one remembered it had ever been there. The women who survived were told to forget, and they did, at least in public. At dinner parties and religious ceremonies and Senate sessions, they performed forgetfulness, like they'd once performed degradation. Their daughters, the ones who'd been 12 and 13 when the summonses started, grew up and had daughters of their own and never, ever discussed what happened in that room. History is written by survivors who learned to smile at the dinner table. Some of them became moral crusaders, the strictest enforcers of female virtue Rome ever produced. They policed other women's clothing, other women's movements, other women's sexuality with a viciousness that came from somewhere deep and unhealed. Because if you can control someone else's purity, maybe you can forget what was done to yours. Some of them killed themselves years later. No reason given, no note left. Just a body found in a bath, or at the bottom of a staircase, or in a garden with a vial of poison still clutched in one hand. The physicians called it melancholy. The priests called it fate. No one called it what it was. Here's what I want you to think about. Not Julia. Julia's dead. Fuck Julia. Think about the room. The room beneath the Palatine Hill that archaeologists excavated in the 20th century and found exactly what the historical sources described. A private amphitheatre with specialised seating and underground chambers, and drains in the floor that weren't connected to any water system. Think about the records. The records that someone burned on the same day Julia died, because they were too dangerous to exist, and too dangerous to keep, and too dangerous to acknowledge. Think about what it means that an entire aristocratic generation, hundreds of women from Rome's most powerful families, experienced systematic, bureaucratized sexual exploitation for 3 years, and not one of them ever wrote about it. Not one memoir, not one letter, not one gravestone inscription that even hints at what happened. The silence is the evidence. The silence is the proof. The silence is the monument to everything that happened in that room. How many rooms like that exist right now, today? Not in ancient Rome, in your city, in institutions you trust, in industries you admire. How many women have walked into what they thought was an opportunity and found themselves in a situation that had rules they didn't agree to, scoring systems they couldn't see, consequences for refusal that no one would ever officially admit existed. The aesthetics change. Economic pressure instead of praetorian guards, reputation destruction instead of chains, non-disclosure agreements instead of imperial scribes. But the architecture is the same. Make someone dependent on you for survival. Offer them a choice that isn't a choice. record the results, and destroy the evidence when it becomes too dangerous to keep. Julia Soaemias Bassiana was a monster. She was also completely typical. Power has been doing what she did for as long as civilization has existed. The only unusual thing about Julia was how well documented her system was before someone tried to burn every trace of it. Historians recorded her name, Julia Soaemias Bassiana, mother of Emperor Elagabalus, woman of unusual appetites, killed by the Praetorian Guard in 222 CE. Body dumped in the Tiber, they recorded her son's name. They recorded the date of the assassination. They recorded that Severus Alexander became emperor afterward and restored traditional Roman values. They didn't record Claudia Severa's daughter's name. They didn't record how many women died in that room, or in their baths afterward, or years later, when the memories became too heavy. They didn't record how many daughters grew up watching their mothers drink wine in silence and refused to explain why they flinched at the color purple. Rome remembered the Empress who broke them. It forgot every woman she shattered. If you made it this far, you understand what this channel does. We don't educate, we exhume. We dig up the body's history buried under marble monuments and clean prose, and we make you look at them. Smash like if this matters to you. Subscribe if you want more truth that the textbook sanitized and the historians euphemized and the powerful hoped you'd never find. And comment below. What other historical atrocity has been scrubbed so clean you can barely see the blood? What pattern from Julia's system have you seen replicated somewhere else? I read the comments. I want to know what you see when you look at history with the lights on. This is the historian facts. I don't do documentary bullshit. I do the rot underneath the marble. Until next time, power doesn't corrupt. Power reveals what was already there. And what was already there is so much worse than you wanted to believe.